Hello, and welcome to the webinar, Demystifying Accessibility, Making PDFs Work for Everyone. My name is Katrina Fox, and I'm the Demand Generation Manager for Crawford Technologies. Before we start today's presentation, I want to take care of some housekeeping. You are all muted, but if you do have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A widget or your chat window in your control panel. Also, this webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to all so you can rewatch it or send it on to your colleagues. So let me introduce today's presenters. We have Michaela Thompson. She is a Technical Accessibility Support Analyst at Crawford Technologies and has been with the company for over 4.5 years. She has a background in manual remediation, alternate format transcription, and building automated accessibility templates for high-volume transactional documents. Chuck Killorin is Millennium's Executive Creative Director. He's been designing for the web since '94. He has a strong background in fine art, design, and web development, and for the last 10 years has championed accessible design and development both internally and externally. He spearheaded major client projects, including JP Morgan Chase's corporate website redesign, Selective Insurance's rebranding, and Grupo Bimbo's accessible web development platform for brands like Intimates, Little Bites, and Thomas's. Coffey is Millennium's Design Director and has been a key member of their creative team since 2015. And in that time, she developed accessibility best practices for PDF and web design, applying them to corporate brand guidelines and production workflows. Sarah has both worked on and led digital creative for Chase, Marriott Bonvoy, Intimates, PayPal, and National Grid. And with that, I'll hand it over to Chuck to discuss what we'll be covering today.
Thanks so much, Katrina. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. We're so excited to bring you this webinar, and I feel confident you'll come away with some valuable insights and a better understanding of the importance of accessibility for digital assets. Today, we'll be covering best practices in accessible PDF design and production workflows. We're going to be showing how Accessibility Now Remediate can drastically cut down remediation and verification time compared to industry standard tools. We're going to be showing how Remediate has enhanced our workflow at Millennium and added value for our clients. And then finally, we'll open the floor for questions. Let's get started with a little bit about our two companies. Katrina?
All right, thanks, Chuck. So at Crawford Technologies, our product services and domain expertise reside at the nexus of content, data, and output management, and are essential components of our customers' digital transformation, output management, and document accessibility strategies. Our enterprise output tools are the fastest and most accurate data transforms and post-composition solutions on the market, and they run on virtually all platforms and provide easy-to-use licensing and unparalleled throughput. Crawford Technologies' commitment to inclusion ensures that we provide accessibility and compliance tools to ensure that every person can access the same information, and our auto-tagging tools automate many manual tasks, providing significant cost savings and reduced time to completion. And in a world of information governance, our content services tools help optimize your data and provide high-speed access to ensure that as an organization, you can archive your data in a compliant manner, access it quickly, and deliver it to any channel based on your end user requirements. Crawford Technologies provides the tools that simplify the work behind your workflow. Established in 1995, Crawford Technologies is now comprised of multiple companies, with over 170 employees, over 1,800 customers, and growing at a 20% year-over-year. A true global company providing data and accessibility solutions around the world with multiple locations in Canada, the US, and UK. Our client base ranges small to large customers, and we partner with 7 of the top 10 banks, 17 of the top 20 insurance companies, 5 largest healthcare payers in the US, and print service providers of all sizes worldwide, and blue chip partners all over the globe. And we deliver solutions through these platforms, our enterprise output management, e-delivery platform, and our Accessibility Now platform. Software is the engine, however, it takes a great partner to ensure you maximize the value from your software investment and meet your project goals. And with all the changes in your customers' expectations and technology, you need a strong vendor to help you through those uncharted waters, and we're that vendor. So with that, I'll hand it over to Chuck to tell us a little bit more about Millennium.
Okay, great. So Millennium is a full-service digital marketing agency. We're based here in New York. We were founded in 1993, and we've been doing digital marketing since before it was a thing. We do what most digital agencies do: user experience, user interface design, web design and development, hosting, graphic design, and branding. But what sets us apart is our focus on the critical elements that, when not done properly, can undermine everything an organization does. So things like consumer data protection, operational security, accessibility, and compliance. All of that is baked in from the start with everything that we do. It's never an afterthought. We've got a pretty varied client base covering financial services, consumer packaged goods, government, and others. We focus primarily on enterprise-level organizations with clients you've likely heard of, like JPMorgan Chase, PayPal, Entenmann's, and Thomas's. To some you probably haven't, like Milmax, Selective, and the Nassau County Industrial Development Association. So while enterprise organizations typically are more focused on compliance as they have the budgets for it, tools and processes are getting better and more efficient, allowing things like accessibility to trickle down to more affordable and thus available to a wider range of clients. So let's get into it. What I want to do is I want to level set for some of the things we're going to be discussing today to make sure that we're all on the same page before we dig into the fun technical stuff that Michaela and Sarah are going to cover. So the terms we'll be using today are accessibility, WCAG, screen reader, and remediation. So let's start with accessibility. What is it? Accessibility is the quality of being able to be obtained, used, or understood. Traditionally, that's been applied to physical things like a lever-style door handle that can make a door easier to open, or a ramp that makes it easier to enter a building, possible for someone in a wheelchair. But when we talk about digital assets like websites and especially PDFs, we're talking about the information within those assets being accessible to everyone, especially folks with motor, cognitive, or sensory deficits. So while accessibility in the real world is governed by law, and specifically in the US by 1990's Americans with Disabilities Act, you may know that simply as ADA, there was no need for a digital approach back in 1990 because the web and version 1.0 of the PDF standard didn't even debut until 3 years later in 1993. In addition, the World Wide Web is outside any specific country's jurisdiction. So in May 1999, the WC3, which is the Worldwide Consortium, it's a global consortium developing rules and guidelines for the web, they published the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We call that WCAG for short. This was the first step in establishing guidelines around how to apply the ADA to the web and digital information. The guidelines dictate 3 levels of increasing compliance from single A to double A and finally triple A. But for our work and the purpose of this talk, we focus on double A, and that's considered acceptable for compliance. You're going to hear us talking about a screen reader. So that's a tool for users with visual impairments that does exactly what you think it does. It reads a web page or a PDF out loud to these folks. Screen readers are available as separate applications, or they're embedded into the OS, either desktop or mobile. If you've stumbled across the accessibility settings on your iPhone, that's where you'll find it. And they've steadily grown better and better over the years. Sarah's going to have a very cool example of what a screen reader experience is like a little later on. The final term is remediation. So this is the actual process of making a digital asset accessible. For the purpose of this talk, we're focusing on PDFs and how we can modify the document to ensure that screen reader technologies provide the same information as a visual reader does so they can understand it. Okay, so now that we have the terms out of the way, so let's talk about the why. So with over 36 million residents in the US alone that have a visual or a hearing deficit, accessibility just isn't an option for business anymore. It's a huge part of the market that won't be able to understand or recognize any of your content without having accessibility applied. With ADA-related lawsuits increasing, businesses are put into legal and or financial jeopardy, with 2022 being a record year for lawsuits, with an average of 80 to 100 lawsuits filed each week. It's over 4,000 last year. Not only that, but consumer brands risk brand reputation damage in a world that's increasingly sensitive to slights, whether intentional or not. And if those weren't reasons enough, being a good citizen and legality. How about just plain old leaving money on the table? Internet retailers alone are losing over $6.9 billion in estimated sale losses by ignoring accessibility needs, and thus a significant portion of consumers. So I'll step off my soapbox now. I'm going to pass the mic over to Sarah. You ready, Sarah?
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Chuck. From the stats we just reviewed, it's clear that accessibility is important for business reasons, but it's just as important for your brand and for the consistency of your messaging. And while this is true for all marketing materials, it becomes critical when we're talking about accessible documents with varying complexities and content. By not making those documents accessible, you may end up saying actually the wrong thing or leaving critical information hidden from your audience. To the left of our slide, I created a simple kind of sample document with some event details for us to use as a reference. Now, as sighted users, we can clearly interpret that information, process it easily and accurately due to layouts, font size, visual order, things like that. But for somebody who doesn't have those capabilities, let's listen to how this document sounds with a screen reader without any remediation having been done. Now, before I hit play, the screen reader experience can be a little bit jarring at first, but know that our audience is used to this experience. And the robotic kind of reading of it is not as much of an issue. Just want to kind of parse that because it can be different.
Upcoming events, trade show, volunteer events, September 8th, 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. August 24th, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Millennium Business Center, 123 Millennium Street, New York. NY Crawford Complex, 123 Crawford Avenue, New York, NY.
So you may have noticed that the dates and times for both events were read under the heading of volunteer event. So something as simple as information order can quickly cause confusion and misinformation. So after listening to this PDF, our visually impaired users may end up showing up to the wrong event, thinking that it's something entirely different than it really is. Now let's listen to that same screen reading experience after the document has been made accessible.
Upcoming events, trade show, August 24th, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Millennium Business Center, 123 Millennium Street, New York. NY volunteer event, September 8th, 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. Crawford Complex, 123 Crawford Avenue, New York, NY.
So now all content has been read in order and makes much more sense to that end user. The most common types of PDFs we come across are reports, forms, and legal publications. Now for Millennium, I'd say this makes up almost all of the remediation that we do day to day, but there are other niche document types that as a user we come across often and say, there's no way that's an accessible document. Restaurant menus and product manuals, I think, are notorious for not being compliant for different reasons. Restaurant menus are often uploaded as images and translated to PDF without being remediated, so it's just a static image. And manuals are often mass produced, and it's just quite an undertaking to get those remediated. Something else we see often is that our clients spend a lot of time creating documents in publishing programs like Word or PowerPoint. They ultimately forget that they need to convert them to a PDF in order for it to live on their site. So when the time comes to publish those and remediation wasn't built into the schedule, the pressure is on to deliver accessible files in a very tight time frame. So let's talk about the workflow of these documents. We've talked a little bit about what they could be, and this is how we kind of publish those. First, content is designed with accessibility in mind. At this stage, items like form fields are given descriptive labels, color contrast is checked for all content, text and non-text combinations. Now, very often we're plugged in at this phase where we work with copywriters, so we're doing all of these little things as we move through design and revisions. So revision rounds are conducted until all content is final and designs are approved. Again, every step of the way, we're doing those checks for making sure everything is passing. Next is sign-off, which is a really critical step for accessibility. PDF remediation should only be completed on a final document. Even minor text changes can have an impact to layout of a page or all subsequent pages and can break the tagging structure of an already accessible document, which does make us have to kind of start over if that's the case. So it's a very important step. Now, after that step, there's a little bit of a preliminary review that we do, and that's just to review the source files and the PDF for any last minute fixes that might impact those source files. So this typically includes things like font embedding, color contrast, anything that we really should address from the content side rather than the kind of behind the scenes work. Now, this is a very important step, not even just for the work that we do from the content side all the way through our process, but for those documents that we get directly from our clients that they made or a third-party vendor or something of that nature, because those things we can also remediate without having done those prior steps. Next, we move into PDF remediation, where the document is tagged. Alternate text is written for all visual content like images or charts or forms or anything like that. And the reading order is set. This can take 1 to 5 days, depending on the length and complexity of the document and the tool in which a document is remediated. Having a good accessibility tool helps us keep our remediation schedules to a minimum. I'd say we used to kind of be at that 3 to 7 day mark, and we've been able to really keep those more consolidated with Remediate. So now I'll hand it over to Michaela at Crawford to talk about the aspects of a good remediation tool.
Thank you, Sarah. So, yeah, so having a good remediation tool is definitely a key piece of that workflow that Sarah was just discussing.
Sorry, my screen share went away. Let me fix that for you.
No worries. All right. No worries. Okay, so yeah, let's get into these aspects of a good remediation tool. So you'd certainly want a tool that's easy to use, and there are many things that can contribute to that aspect. If the tool is GUI driven and has shortcuts, it can be more intuitive and in turn makes the experience as a user much more enjoyable and actually makes it easier to use. If the tool also has a feature that can automatically suggest a tagging structure, so if you don't have to manually build out the tag tree tag by tag, that can be a huge time saver, especially in larger, more complex documents. Quick and easy to implement, you definitely want something that's going to fit seamlessly into your already existing workflow. Cost effectiveness is always a big deal, huge as well. And a good tool doesn't need to cost a fortune, right? So, and being a standalone tool can actually contribute to this aspect as it eliminates the cost of other or additional tools. And last but not least, a good remediation tool absolutely needs to meet PDF accessibility compliance. You want to ensure that the tagged PDFs coming out the other side are actually compliant and usable. And compliance can be easily checked if the tool also has built-in validation. So let's get into some demonstrations. So we're going to see the same PDF tagged in 2 different remediation tools. Adobe Acrobat, which tends to be the default option for most organizations, and then Accessibility Now Remediate. So we're going to be looking at the differences in approach, timing, and ease of use between the 2 tools, and then drawing some comparisons. So what steps are involved in creating a tag structure? How long does it take to get from point A to point B? How easy or difficult is the tool to use? How many clicks does it take to achieve something, really? So keeping all those questions in mind, let's jump into the Acrobat demonstration. Okay, so getting started on this untagged document, we have opened it in Acrobat, and we have to open our read order tool and then create our tags route first before we can actually start adding any tags. And to add a new tag, I have to right click and select add new tag, and then find the tag that I'm trying to add, which should be the document tag first and foremost. And then adding a section tag to contain all the tags for that page is a good way to organize your tags. So now that I've got those 2 tags as my root, I can actually start tagging the content on the page. So to do that in Acrobat, you just drag over it, and then you have to find what tag you actually want to make it, which in this case would be a figure tag for this logo. And if you'll notice on the left-hand side in our tag tree, it nested that figure tag outside of the document tag. Intuitively, it should have gone inside that section tag we just created to house all these tags we're creating. So, and I actually have to add in my alternate text, and I know that with my tagging knowledge that figure tags need to have alternate text, but there was actually nothing there indicating to me that I needed to put alternate text on this figure tag. So now I'm starting to tag the rest of the document. Next is the H1, but we'll just kind of jump ahead to the next point, which would be tagging the list. So we have to build out all these parts of the list manually, grabbing each label, which is the bullet, and then each L body. I actually had to tag them as paragraphs first, because the label and L body tags are actually not included on the reading order panel, as you can see to the right there. So I had to tag them as paragraphs first and then switch them all at once to labels. And it didn't nest them inside the document tag either. So I'm gonna have to do all that afterwards. And I had to also add my list tag manually at the bottom there. So I'm doing all this for the labels. I'll have to do it all for the L body parts as well, because with a list, you have the label, which is typically the bullet or the number indicating that list item. And then the text for that list item is called the L body. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm going to the properties. At least I can select them all at once and change them all at once. But ideally, you know, if we had those label and L body tags as an option on the reading order panel, this would make this go a little faster. And so now I'm adding in the individual list item tags for each of those. And I'm counting how many list items I have. I've got 7. So now I have to do this 7 times to get this, to get each list item tag for this list. So I'm kind of racing through adding these list items, making sure I've got 7. I need 1 more. And so now I can grab my first label and L body and nest them inside after a couple tries of trying to grab it. And then nesting it inside that first list item tag. So I have to do this 6 more times. Why don't we just jump ahead to the next point? We don't need to sit and watch me struggle through this. So the next point I'm going to talk about is tagging the table. So grabbing the whole table, you know, we have to kind of look for it in the tag tree now. It's not exactly obvious where that table tag is, but I found it nested in 3 different section tags. So now I have to drag it out, put it in the right place, get rid of those extra section tags. And now I'm looking at the table to see if it actually identified any of my table header cells, and it didn't. So now I'm going through, selecting my table header cells and changing them from data cells to header cells. And I've actually got column headers and row headers in this table that need to be identified. So that's what I'm doing here. Just quickly changing those all at once to table header cells. And it wasn't exactly obvious where I should put my table summary on this table tag. You would think that maybe on the properties, there'd be somewhere to put the table summary, but there isn't. So that wasn't exactly intuitive or obvious either. So on to the next point, we will discuss the notes at the bottom of the page. So here I have to individually tag each note. And it's a little difficult to see them because they are so small. You know, the footnotes are always the smallest part of the document. So tagging them was a little bit of a struggle, you know, getting them individually since they're so close together. And at least the note tag is actually there on the reading order tool, so I don't have to make any changes there. But with notes, you should have the note indicator or the superscript item, the asterisk, whatever it is that's indicating it's a note, should be marked as a label inside of that note. So I actually have to come in and separate those elements within that tag and make sure that, you know, this one here is being labeled as a label. So I'm separating them into 2 different notes, and then I will just change the properties on this note so that it's a label instead. And then I'll nest that inside the note, and I'll do the same for the other 3. But we won't watch me do that 2 more times, so we'll move on to the next point. And so with notes, there's going to be references. And so now I'm going back into each paragraph tag, and there's some in the list as well, but we'll just talk about these ones in the paragraph. I have to go in and identify each superscript as a reference. So it's a very manual process. It's a little tricky to do, especially when you're dealing with small text. Grabbing that piece individually can be a challenge. And then nesting that reference tag in between each sentence so that the read order is proper on those references. A lot of time spent doing this. Very tedious process. So at this point, I'm just kind of exhausted watching this process. So how about we switch to the Accessibility Now Remediate demo? Okay, so we're starting with an untagged document. And once we load the document in to remediate, I'll back up a little bit. And we'll load the document in, see what happens once we get that document opened in remediate. So it took a second there, just maybe like a half second, to look at all the page elements and provide actually a fully tagged document for us. And I'm able to get right into putting alt text on these figure tags that are already there. I didn't have to mark them. I didn't have to start with a document tag or anything. And I actually have the option to edit all the alt text at once with that tool and change anything to an artifact, maybe that doesn't have to be tagged. And there's my alt text right there that I just added. So we're starting with a fully tagged document, and now I'm just checking through, making sure that my read order is correct. My list is already identified. I've already got those references marked up inside that list. So now I just need to tag this table, since all the tags up to this point are good to go. So I'm just gonna select table on my tagging assistant over there. And now I've got a fully tagged table. I just have a little bit of finishing left to do. And that's just to add a table summary. So the table summary, where to add that was obvious. It's right there. All my headers have been identified already. I can see that by the different color on the markup. So I don't need to make any changes to my tags there. So we'll move on to the next point, which is we're going to address the notes again. Here we can see that the notes have already been identified based on the tag label, telling me that's a note with an N there. And so I see that I do have to merge these two note tags, but I actually don't have to drag a box around it to do that and struggle with that tiny text. I can actually just select both of those note tags that have already been created at once and then just merge them together. So now I'm doing one last look through, checking my read order, making sure my tag types are correct. It's always good to do a last look through. And so now I'm actually at a point where I can run my validation step. And here it's included right on the tagging assistant, right on the same window. And it's prompting me to add that document title because it actually will cause a compliance error if I don't. And after running the step, I can see that it's passed all three of the standards that I was checking for. And from here, I'm ready to generate my accessible PDF and my compliance report at the same time. At this point, using Acrobat, I was still trying to get that list tagged. So I think it kind of speaks for itself there. So I know we just saw a lot happen. So let's recap. Using Acrobat, it took over 20 minutes to get to a point where I could run the accessibility checker. The whole tagging process was not intuitive. I had to use whatever tag options I was given and then make changes after. Tags were placed randomly throughout the tag tree. I had to do a lot of adjusting there. The whole process was very manual from start to finish. But using Remediate, it took less than 5 minutes to get the same document fully tagged and fully compliant. The GUI was very intuitive, guiding me through clearing common compliance errors and showing the tag types and read order clearly on each tag. Everything I needed was on one screen, and the tags that AutoSense created needed almost no adjustments or changes.
So in those videos Michaela just walked us through, we saw a few great things. Beyond paragraphs and headings, we can now see that accessibility handles more complex content like links, forms, tables, graphics, and footnotes in a way that provides the same value to a user with a screen reading device as we have as sighted users. So historically, tables have been a huge undertaking when performing remediation. And in the demo, we got a small taste of the manual effort that went into a very small and simple table, but what happens when they become more complex? Especially in the financial space, large data tables are a common occurrence and used to take hours to be made accessible. We also found that the table regularity, meaning the proper alignment of columns and rows, was often not achieved with repeatable results, and it was simply a headache. In fact, one of the things that instantly sold us on Remediate was the way in which the tool handles these more complex processes. So now Michaela is going to take us through the very same demo we received when we were shopping around for a new accessibility tool.
Okay. Are we all seeing my screen? Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
So this is Accessibility Now Remediate. I have a 12-page document loaded in here, but I'm just trying to focus on this complex table here. So if I turn off my tag markup for a second, we can get a better idea of what's going on behind all that. And we can see we've got a table with 9 columns, and it's got some span column headers at multiple levels. So I can't imagine having to listen to this with a screen reader and having it not be tagged correctly. But we can actually do that quickly with Remediate, or having to tag this using anything else really. So I'm just going to grab that whole tagged or table area, and I'm going to come over to my tagging assistant and tag it quickly as a table. And it quickly snaps to the table. And I can see, just looking at it without even getting into the table editor yet, that it's applied that span to each of these spanning column headers. It's identified these row headers as well, but I do have a little bit of cleaning up to do in here, but it's not going to take me too long at all. So I'm going to open my table editor by just double clicking there. Make this a little bigger so I can see the whole table. And so I see that I need to adjust my columns a little bit. That's okay. I'll just drag it right over. Give it a second to adjust, just because I don't want these letters to be cut off and included in the wrong column. Okay, that looks good. So I've got a couple of column headers that have text wrapping in them. So it did split them into 2 different rows, but I can just quickly merge those rows back together by selecting my first row and then my second row as well. And I'll right click and merge those into one table row. So now I just need to re-identify those as headers. So I can do that all at once by doing the same thing, clicking at the front of the row and just telling them all that they need to be row or column headers. And so I'm going to check my span column header here. And when I do that, it's actually highlighting all of these cells, or these header cells on top of it. And that's just indicating to me that the associations have been linked between this span column header and all the headers above it. So with complex tables, we need to have IDs applied to each header cell, and then any data cell or header cell that applies to that needs to be linked with an association. So we actually have a list of all the header cells in the table that have been identified based on their row and column placement, and then the text that's actually in there. So you don't really have to guess at which associations you're applying between the data cells and the header cells. And I can check my data cells as well, and I can see it's already been applied to that row header, this span column header, and then the column header above it. So having to do this in Acrobat, for example, would take a very long time because there's no automation in applying these associations between the header cells and their data cells or the column cells. You have to do all that manually, and it's definitely not intuitive like this. So now that I know my associations and my headers are all good to go, I just have to do one last thing, and that's give this a table summary, because it's giving me this warning symbol here. If I check the problems, it's telling me that table summary cannot be blank. So the GUI is actually guiding me and telling me to clear this compliance error here. And I actually can't even finish out of my table yet until I put that table summary in there. So I'm just going to call this, I'm going to call it corporate bonds for now. And now that I've got my summary in there, I can actually finish out my table. And you'll see it snaps to those changes that I made directly after. So now at this point, I am going to run my validation step just to check for any table regularity errors. We're probably going to see some errors in here for these figures that don't have alternate text, but we're just kind of focusing on the table here. So I'm running that. I'm going to close it, and it actually breaks down on the validation step by compliance standard. You can choose whichever one you want to check for, or you can check for all of them, but I'm not seeing any table regularity errors in here. It's just looking for alt text on these figures, and we have a heading nesting issue as well that I would clear up afterwards, but we're just focusing on the table here. So with that, I will pass it back to Sarah.
And Sarah, you're muted, so we can't hear you.
Thanks, Katrina.
Yeah, no worries.
Didn't want to disturb Michaela during her presentation, which was really excellent. Looking at all of that useful work that we just saw and seeing how that might plug into our workflow, let's dive a little bit into how PDF remediation has evolved now that we've added remediate. So no surprise, this is going to plug into our remediation phase. Here I've outlined our old process with Acrobat, which was about 8 steps, and the new one with remediate. So at a glance, we've been able to eliminate 2 and then simplify many more of those steps with the remediate workflow. First, the manual pre-work that we used to do to set us up for greater success in Acrobat is no longer needed due to the AutoSense capabilities in remediate. These are things like assigning heading levels, defining table details. This step alone has had a significant time savings. Next, the highly manual tagging and ordering process has decreased exponentially, again, from that AutoSense technology, and we saw this perfectly in that demo with the table. The built-in validation features in remediate allow us to identify alternate text requirements and solve for those as we go, versus having to kind of finish our remediation process, do our manual checks, and then realize that we needed to go back and fix something. And finally, the detail in the compliance reports eliminates the dependency on other third-party testing tools, which saves us another step. And speaking of those compliance reports, one of our initial tests once we had remediate was to compare the testing functionality between those built-in compliance reports and that third-party testing tool that we had been using, which is the industry standard pretty much. And we've consistently found 0 discrepancies between both. So we have the utmost confidence that when remediate provides a passing report, we know it's going to hold up for our clients. So after working in remediate for just a few months, we've already seen tremendous benefits. With the native validation features we discussed, we've been able to get ahead of potential errors before the testing phase. Results are reliable, the effort is much more manageable, and most importantly, the efficiencies have enabled us to take on more mediation work and pass the time and cost savings onto our clients. So thank you all for tuning in as we demystified accessibility. I know we had a couple of questions come in through our presentation, so Katrina will help field those for us.
Right. Thank you all for that great presentation, including Michaela for that great demo. So as Sarah just said, if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A widget or the chat window, and I will pass those along to our presenters. But yeah, as Sarah said, we had a few that came through while we were presenting. The first one here is, I have a large library of documents. Can those be made accessible without the original source files?
Yes. So while remediate is, for single document tagging, we also have a tool called Accessibility Now Publisher, and that's used for, tagging batches of documents at once. So you can load as many documents in as you need, maybe that whole library, and run them through a process, and they'll all come out tagged in the end.
Great. What format is the compliance report in?
So the compliance report actually comes in a couple different formats. So we have just a plain text format. There's also an XML format, and then there's a plain PDF and also an accessible PDF version, because the compliance report should also be accessible. So yeah, it comes in all 4 of those formats.
Great. Do you have a way of scanning a public site to make sure your documents are accessible?
We do. So that is our tool called DocMD. That is the tool that you can enter any URL that you want to crawl or perform a crawl on, and it will search that website, come back with all the PDFs or documents that it finds, and it will also run a scan simultaneously as it's finding those documents to check the compliance level. So it pairs with our validator tool and comes back with a report for each document that it finds. And you can test for PDF UA, WCAG, or HHS, or all of those standards at once, and the report will reflect passes or failures for each standard.
What happens when I have to change my document once it's been remediated and published?
So this is actually something we do experience often, again, in the financial space, and we're dealing with data, and we're dealing with many stakeholders. Sometimes changes come in post-launch, sometimes data does have to change and be updated. So it's actually much better than it used to be. Our process before, we would have to make that change in the source file, export it again, and we would likely have to redo the remediation on at least a page, but most likely the document. While it's still definitely not our recommended workflow, and it's a little bit of a can of worms in every situation, they're a little bit unique. Remediate does create something called a REM file, which allows us to maintain our tagging structure independently of the PDF. So as long as there's no really significant impact to the layout of the page where the change is taking place, we can likely keep a lot of the tagging structure from the first round. Now, sometimes even adding a word can cause a rapid paragraph that wasn't there before, or impact the flow of subsequent pages. So there is always a little bit of tweaking that will need to be done to those tags, and it will need to be rechecked to make sure nothing kind of got broken along the way. But it is possible to be done, and we can always make sure that that file name of the document matches what's being hosted on that live site, so that when we hand off a new file, it's very easy for the digital team to implement from the website.
Do you need a VPAT to demonstrate compliance, or VPAT? The acronym that was used.
Do you want me to take that, Sarah? It depends on the end client. Some clients do require that. It's essentially a certificate that states that the digital asset that you created is accessible. You run through an entire checklist and check off everything. It's a secondary step after the tool's been remediated and gone through its verification steps, and it ends up just being delivered as a PDF or Word document, and it's something the client just holds on to. Should the accessibility team or some kind of compliance requirement need it, they have it, and that usually specifically for our work with JPMorgan Chase, all of our web and PDF report type work that's done requires a VPAT.
I'm going to give a quick update there, Chuck.
Oh.
So I think so far, only the digital, the HTML site work has needed VPAT. So for now,
great.
PDFs are kind of exempt from that VPAT rule, but I think it is a case-by-case preference based on, whatever that legal team or accessibility team is really just requiring to have on hand.
Well, it looks like those are all of the questions that have come through so far, but I'll just reiterate and give people more time if they do have more questions. But this webinar has been recorded, and we will get that out to everybody who registered for the webinar. Yeah, looks like that's all the questions. So with that, we want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. We hope you have a great rest of your day. And with that, we will conclude the webinar. Thanks all. Have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.